Hello, my name is Jaru. Today I'm talking about Deltarune. There will be major spoilers for both Deltarune and Undertale, so please play them both before watching this. Today we're talking about the bizarre and fascinating lore provided by one particular enemy in the Dark World. As you likely guessed from the thumbnail, this video is gonna have everything from shipping fodder to world building to supernatural theory crafting, so I'm quite certain there will be something in here for everyone. If you enjoyed this video, consider supporting me on Patreon, as this is but the first of many Deltarune videos you'll be receiving in 2023. This is Poppup. It's a bizarre, dolphin-like enemy who is supposedly a reference to some pet training game from the 90s. Poppup is the physical embodiment of Poppup Ads, and whether intentional or not, it provides some fascinating insights into our main characters through the ads that it shows us. You see, if you choose to click on the ads as Kris, Susie, Ralsei, or Noelle, you'll get a number of different lines about what kind of ads they are drawn to. Now, you may be thinking, Jaru, it specifically says that they accidentally click on those ads. Surely that means it doesn't reflect their characters. However, as you read through these, the evidence supports the notion that even the ones they accidentally click on are still relevant. Take the Susie ads, for example. One of hers is, Susie accidentally clicked on a picture of a steak. It wasn't actually an ad, just a static image of a steak. This line is a clear reference to Susie being hungry pretty much all the time, likely as a consequence of her not being fed by her family. Furthermore, it starts to paint a picture of Susie not being particularly capable when it comes to using computers and technology, which is very in line with her established personality. As such, even though she clicked on this ad by accident, it still gives us some accurate insight into her character, and thus I believe that all of these lines can be used to give us some further understanding of the personalities and desires of our heroes. We've got 4 protagonists to look at, so let's start with the ones with the least interesting pop-up ads and work our way towards the more interesting ones. We can start with Susie, since I already revealed one of her lines. This steak line is definitely the most interesting of the bunch, as it further hints at her likely unpleasant home life. I don't have much to say on this aspect of her character as of now, but it definitely adds some depth and tragedy to Susie that I appreciate. The next pop-up line is, Susie accidentally clicked on an ad featuring a flaming eggplant holding a chainsaw. This one is likely just meant to be a representation of Susie, as she is also purple, also wields power over some sort of dark flame, and she likes violent things like chainsaws. Unfortunately, I don't think there's much more to read into this line beyond that. The third and final pop-up for Susie simply reads, Susie missed clicking on an ad and ended up clicking on the word processor. It got a virus somehow. Much like the steak line, this seems to just be further emphasizing how Susie is not very good with computers. Overall, Susie's pop-ups don't tell us much about her character that we didn't already know, but that's to be expected. Susie has the fewest secrets and mysteries attached to her, and is very much meant to be a character that we can reliably understand. We don't always know for certain what Kris and Ralsei really want, but Susie is an open book, which is appreciated. Speaking of Ralsei, let's take a look at his pop-up lines, as they are both interesting and dubious in terms of their lore relevance. First up is this pop-up, which reads, Ralsei moved to click on an ad with a bunny on it teaching you how to make friends, and accidentally clicked on an ad of a machine gun that appeared over it. Of course, on the surface, this is a pretty basic and silly line. Ralsei wants to have friends, so he tries to click on an ad about making friends, but instead he clicks on a gun ad, as Ralsei having a gun was a fairly popular meme in the immediate aftermath of Chapter Chapter 1's release. It's clear that this is Toby Fox demonstrating his awareness of the internet culture surrounding his game. And that's fun and all, but it does put me in a difficult spot. If we have the context of internet memes, then Ralsei clicking on an ad for a gun doesn't tell us anything, as it seems like it's just a joke. However, without that context, the average player is left to wonder if this is hinting at some hitherto undiscovered aspect of Ralsei's personality. Does he have a dark side that is actually very interested in tools of death and violence like firearms? Is this indicative of some deeper aspect to his character? You could argue this is just a joke, but Toby is known to write his characters in such a way that even if you don't get the reference, you can still understand the essence of the concept. Poppup as a character is one massive reference that you really have no business understanding, and even its jumbled up dialogue is actually butchered Japanese. Obviously, your average American is not supposed to get that, but the comedy of it speaking some mangled version of normal language is still clear even to those who don't know Japanese. By contrast, this line about Ralsei clicking on a gun ad could be seen as strangely dark and mysterious to those who aren't in the know about the meme. Although you could easily counter this by saying that the inherent comedy of Ralsei wielding a gun is still clear to the player even if you don't know about the meme. Regardless, now you see what I meant when I said Ralsei's pop-up ads are rather dubious in terms of their lore relevance. Let's look at some of his other lines and see if they're any more helpful. Next is this pop-up, which says, Ralsei accidentally clicked on an ad for lighteners for darkeners in your area and was mortified. He deleted the browser shortcut on the desktop entirely, but immediately felt guilty because he thought he had, quote, deleted the entire internet. Now, this line is fascinating for a couple of reasons. The fact that Ralsei wants friends, especially Lightner friends, and yet is mortified by this specific ad makes it extremely clear that this ad was referencing the sketchy dating ads that you see on various websites. These ads are typically very, let's just say, inappropriate in nature, which makes this reaction from Ralsei completely understandable, as him being seen clicking on such an ad by his two Lightner friends would absolutely be mortifying. That said, this last bit about him deleting the internet is a little confusing, as Ralsei normally demonstrates an unusual quantity of knowledge regarding how technology works. Case in point, he theorized that Spamton was a corrupted program and made a joke about putting the Darkners into sleep mode. As such, him being ignorant enough to think he deleted the internet seems a little out of character. The only way I can rationalize this is that this line is meant to show that Ralsei has some knowledge of computers and technology, otherwise he wouldn't even know how to delete a shortcut like this, but he also has clear limitations to that knowledge. Of course, this could just be a case of Toby Fox sacrificing logic in the name of making a joke. But before we get ahead of ourselves, we need to revisit the first part of this line, as this bit about lighteners for darkeners in your area is actually really interesting. The romantic nature of this ad seems to potentially be implying that Ralsei is actually attracted to one or more lighteners. Even the fact that he was so mortified seems to imply that he has a sufficient understanding of what this ad is implying that he could imagine and be embarrassed by it, which could be read as proof that he feels this way. Why be embarrassed about something that doesn't apply to you? Also, as we'll see with Noelle later on, these romance-oriented ads tend to be pretty accurate depictions of the characters and their desires. So this definitely raises some questions about what exactly Ralsei feels towards Kris and Susie. While I'm sure the shippers are frothing at the mouth at this interpretation, I also find it interesting within the context of my Ralsei theory, as if Ralsei really is some special entity who is halfway between a darkener and a lightener, then him having romantic feelings for a lightener would make sense, especially if he already has memories inherited from Asriel, as Asriel himself is heavily implied to have had romantic interests of his own. Needless to say, this is a fascinating little foray into romantic territory, and it's certainly not going to be the last we see in these ads. The third and final Ralsei pop-up reads as follows. Ralsei tried to click on an ad with a castle on it, but it was actually an ad for a company that demolishes buildings with bazookas. Again, this is really just a reimagining of the gun meme from earlier. Ralsei tries to click on something we already associate with him, but he instead clicks on something absurdly violent and destructive. Is this just a meaningless joke? Is this indicative that he's resentful of his role as the prince of a kingdom? Is this hinting at a secret desire to engage in violence and destruction? It's obviously impossible to say. Ralsei is a very fascinating character, but with memes getting involved here, it's much harder to filter the lore from the jokes. Thankfully, these next characters are much more direct with the meaning behind their ads. Next is Noelle, and boy do her ads tell a story. First is the most infamous of these ads, which reads, Noelle clicked on a link for hot female Santas in your area. This is hilarious, of course, but it's also kinda interesting to dissect. I believe this is a case of the advertisement algorithm taking note of two different aspects of Noelle's personality and mashing them together, which we've actually seen demonstrated before in the form of Queen. Queen filled Noelle's room with stuff from her internet search history, but there were clearly some misunderstandings. Most notably, Noelle is looking for her sister, December Holiday, but Queen did not comprehend this, and instead gave her a calendar filled with December 25th, because that's the date of the biggest December holiday. In a similar algorithm mishap, I think this line from Poppup is mashing together two things that Noelle has shown interest in. The first is obviously Christmas, as Christmas is a pretty big deal to the Holiday family. And as for the hot female part, well, I think her interest in Susie explains this one well enough. There's a reason Queen put an epic female statue in her bedroom. The pop-up algorithm simply combined her interest in Christmas with her interest in women to hilarious results. But it only gets more interesting from here. Next is this line. Noelle clicked on a link for creepy game glitch compilations. At the time of chapter 2, this line didn't really make much sense to us, as we didn't have the necessary context to understand her interest in such things. But thanks to the Spampton sweepstakes and Noelle's various blogs, we now know that Noelle is keenly interested in all things weird and creepy in video games. As such, this line from Poppup was actually some pretty massive foreshadowing for the content of the Spampton sweepstakes, which is very cool. However, the Noelle pop-up ad that I found to be the most interesting was the third one, which reads, Noelle misclicked on a link to buy How to Draw Dragons. Now, we know that Noelle is attracted to Susie, and we know that the character on the cover of this book is an immodestly dressed purple lady, so Noelle's interest in such a thing is hardly unexpected. And at first glance, you would be forgiven for thinking this goes no deeper than that. However, I've now realized that this is hinting at another character's interests as well. I'm talking about Asriel, the only other person to show an above above average interest in this very book. Tell me, dear viewers, why would Asriel, renowned goody two-shoes, fail to return this book to the library for years on end? I had never really put much thought into the meaning behind this, but the implication given by Kris is pretty blatant. Quote, "How to Draw Dragons is at the bottom of the drawer. The purple character on the cover is dressed immodestly. Your brother will never return this book." There's really only one way to interpret this. Kris is implying that the immodest nature of the purple dragon lady is the precise reason that Asriel won't return the book. This, in turn, implies that Asriel has a type, and that type is purple, draconic, and female. To be clear, this isn't saying that Asriel is interested in Susie. All evidence says that Susie moved to town very recently, and Asriel likely has no idea she even exists. However, we do know that monsters have their own subspecies, so if there's one purple dragon lady, then there's bound to be others that Asriel could have encountered and maybe even dated. If so, then it's possible Asriel was looking up that type of lady on the internet. Why do I suggest this? Well, if you assume Asriel has in fact been looking up purple dragon ladies on the internet, then Susie's reaction to Asriel's room in Queen's Mansion suddenly makes a lot more sense. Upon looking into this room, which should be filled with the physical manifestations of Asriel's internet search history, Susie says this. "Kris, whose room is this? Huh? Your brother? Man, you better hope I never meet him." Yeah, that takes on a totally different connotation now, doesn't it? And Kris's refusal to look into this room can now also be read as Kris simply not wanting to look at their older brother's dubious search history. I should say, this is all just speculation, of course, and I'm not saying I believe this is the definitive interpretation, but it does showcase how much more lore and characterization can be found even in the lines that seem pretty simple like these. This, in turn, brings us to the most interesting character in this pop-up ad discussion. Kris. All three of Kris's ads are fascinating, but we'll start with the one that has the least drama attached to it. You unconsciously clicked on a pop-up ad about monsters for humans in your area. The fact that this ad even exists paints a very interesting picture of the world of Deltarune and Kris as a character. This pretty much confirms that relationships between monsters and humans not only occur, but occur frequently enough to warrant clickbaity ads that cater to this specific demographic. That, in and of itself, is a very interesting direction for Toby to take his setting, and completely reframes the dynamic between the two species. In Undertale, the relationship between humans and monsters was so strained that the idea of them even just being friends was practically impossible, so this aspect of the universe was never explored. Then again, Frisk can flirt with Toriel, go on a date with Papyrus, and on a similar date with Alphys, so I suppose this isn't a completely new concept. But before now, you could argue that it was just the adults humoring a silly kid, and not really indicative of anything more. But Deltarune seems intent on changing all that. Beyond the pure world building this ad provides, it also tells us something pretty important about Kris. Based off their search history, the algorithm believes that Kris is interested in dating monsters. Considering monsters are the only people Kris gets to interact with, that adds up, and given their seemingly negative reaction to seeing other humans, this is a pretty logical direction for a developing teenager to go. However, it also means that we now know that romance is, in fact, on Kris's mind, and I think it's pretty clear who they may have their eyes on. Upon making Kris drink Susie tea, this specific interaction occurs. Kris, upon drinking the tea, proceeds to look at Susie in such a way that it flusters her. She yells, "Stop looking at me!" And Ralsei, thinking to himself, comments, "They seem into it." This is the only flavor of tea that Kris gives a visibly positive reaction to. If that weren't enough, Susie is one of the only characters to successfully make Kris smile later in this very chapter. And in the prologue story on Noelle's blog, Susie is also the only person to successfully make Kris laugh. And when Susie asks Kris who they would take to the festival, Noelle or Ralsei, Kris sounds confused no matter which of these options you pick, implying that neither of those options are ones that Kris would actually choose if they were in control. That just leaves the Susie option and the ellipses option. If you say Susie, Kris doesn't sound confused, meaning they really would prefer to go with Susie. And given her facial expression, I think Kris said this with some emotion. Even the ellipses option seems to hint at what Kris would prefer, as if you say nothing, they instead just stare intensely at Susie, weirding her out in a similar way to how they did when drinking Susie tea. As such, if Kris really is interested in monsters, Susie is pretty much the only option they've shown any meaningful interest in. Naturally, this means that Kris is healed a whopping 120 HP when drinking Susie tea, which is much more than any other option. Of course, Noelle is healed for 400 HP when drinking Susie tea, but that makes sense. Noelle is downright obsessed with Susie, to the point that Queen felt justified putting a statue of her in Noelle's bedroom. And the majority of Noelle's lines tie into this crush in one way or another. You could even argue that Noelle has an unhealthy obsession with Susie, as even in her blog, talking about how cruelly Susie treated Kris, she still ends it with her being thirsty for Susie as usual, implying that even Susie acting awfully isn't enough to push Noelle away. But back on topic, in terms of Kris as a character, they seem to genuinely have feelings for Susie, and whether these feelings are platonic or romantic, they definitely exist, and we can conclude all that and connect all these dots thanks to this one random line from Poppup. But now, with the light-hearted stuff out of the way, we can move on to the drama. The second ad Kris clicks on says, "You unconsciously clicked on an ad for a video about making knives out of spaghetti." Combined with this line from Kris's room in Queen's mansion, in which they apparently looked up Jello knife, and this all seems to paint a disturbing picture of Kris as being somewhat obsessed, not only with knives in general, but with the act of creating knives. As I've explained in a previous video, this Jello knife item is likely in reference to a viral YouTube video in which a man created a functional knife out of Jello. On its own, it was a bizarre peculiarity to see associated with Kris, but with this pop-up ad, we now have 2 instances of Kris researching very similar things, and that implies a more significant trend than I had previously realized. Of course, this could be another hot female Santa situation, where Kris isn't actually interested in creating knives from food. Instead, they may have simply looked up how to make jello or how to make spaghetti, and then, on another occasion, they did some research into knives. Just as Poppup combined Noelle's romantic interests with her love of Christmas, it could be that these algorithms are combining Kris's cooking interests, which we know they have, with their love of knives. Either way, this does further emphasize that Kris doesn't just use knives for various things, they seem to have an active interest in the knives themselves. Why this is the case is up for interpretation, but no matter what, it doesn't look good for Kris. This segues nicely into the third and final pop-up ad that Kris clicks on, which reads, "You unconsciously clicked on a pop-up about demon summoning classes for teens." This line opens up a nightmarish can of worms, as there are so many avenues of discussion we have to bring up here. Firstly, we know that Kris has a history with the occult, as Caddy explicitly states that she and Kris studied it together. As such, it seems highly likely that Kris at least considered summoning a demon at some point, with them doing enough research into the idea that they're being shown a pop-up ad about it. Whether they actually attempted such a thing is unclear, but it seems like a very valid possibility. This, in turn, brings us to the 2 main questions we have to ask. Did Kris successfully summon a demon? And, perhaps more importantly, why did they attempt such a thing? With regards to the first question, this is both a fascinating possibility and a completely pointless topic to discuss. You see, demons have always been a concept within Toby Fox's work, but they've also been given basically no lore regarding what they are, how they function, and what relevance they have in the stories of Undertale and Deltarune. I'm not exaggerating when I say that demons have less lore in these games than Gaster, which is saying a lot. In Undertale, we're given a single line from Kara where they call themselves a demon. And then, in the code of the game, we find 5 variables labeled Demon A, B, C, D, and X. The first 4 of these are assigned this text, which reads, "Greetings, you have made yourself completely clear. Understood. I, your humble servant, will follow you to the utmost." In my opinion, this text sounds like we're hearing one side of a conversation, with this demon character responding to instructions from their master, whoever that is. And then there's Demon X, which is also sorta assigned some text, but unlike the other demons, Demon X is featured in the code that governs the part of the game where you name the fallen child. There's a lot of text in this code that governs which names will earn responses from various Undertale characters, but Demon X isn't linked into any of this. Their line is found at the very top of the code, and it simply consists of an ellipses in parentheses, as if they're watching in silence as you name the fallen child. And hilariously, that is all of the known demon lore. I mean, technically, there is also this NPC who's labeled Red Demon in the code, but I'm inclined to think that's just shorthand for them being a species of monsters who superficially resemble a stereotypical demon. I don't think they are actually tied in to the rest of this background demon lore, although that is just an assumption on my part. Regardless, to say our understanding of demons in this universe is limited is a gross understatement. So while Kris summoning a demon could be pretty significant, we really have no idea what it means for the story. I know that some people will automatically conclude that Kris did summon a demon, and that this demon was Kara, and Kara is then the one who possessed Kris. I personally don't agree with that interpretation, mostly because it would be too easy of an explanation. It's like, oh man, if Kris summoned a demon, and Kara is a demon, and they both got red eyes, then maybe Kara possessed Kris. I mean, it just feels too obvious. And perhaps more importantly, I don't think that reveal would be particularly compelling or shocking. It's a lot more interesting if Kris is possessed by an actual character and not just this weird thing from the end of the genocide route. But that is, of course, just my opinion, and you are free to interpret this information however you please. That said, before we wrap up, I will go ahead and give my reading of these demon summoning shenanigans and explain how I personally think it factors into this narrative. As my returning viewers likely suspect, this all fits quite nicely into my Azrael theory. For those not in the know, I've theorized that the one possessing Kris is Azrael, and that he died a tragic death as a consequence of Kris's actions. As a result, Kris has spent weeks, if not months, trying to find any conceivable way to resurrect their brother. This includes researching magic on the internet, learning about the occult with Caddy, reading old mysterious books that they keep under their desk, and, as of Chapter 2, creating a dark fountain in their own home. If Kris is willing to create dark fountains, despite Ralsei warning that it could doom the world, then this paints a pretty clear picture of Kris's state of mind. They would do anything, no matter how dangerous, if they thought it would save their brother. And I suspect that also included attempting to summon a demon. If they're willing to risk the entire world, then making a deal with the devil is hardly out of character. I'm going to go ahead and say that I think Kris absolutely attempted to conjure a demon. And while I'm uncertain regarding whether they succeeded, I can confidently predict why they tried to do it, which is probably the best strength of my theory. You can theorize all sorts of reasons for why Kris would summon a demon or create a world-threatening dark fountain, but most explanations would come across as rather contrived, purely because it's such a dangerous act. You only resort to doing something like this if you are in a truly dire situation, and I can imagine few situations more dire than resurrecting the brother that you caused the death of. Any lower stakes would either come across as absurd or require you to depict Kris as a willful villain in this story, neither of which are options that I'm inclined to go with. As such, I think all this demon business was just one of many desperate pleas from a child trying to undo their terrible mistake. And with that, we've reached the end of the video. This one was a little on the short side, admittedly, but better to have short content than no content. Poppup provided some very interesting character insights, and I can't wait to see what you guys in the comments have to say about it. I'm sure you'll mostly be interested in the shipping implications, but I personally found the topic of demons to be the most intriguing, purely because it's such a mysterious and unexplored aspect of Toby Fox's world. Regardless, I hope you guys enjoyed my first Deltarune video of 2023. My sincere thanks go out to my patrons for continuing to financially support me and this channel. A special shout out goes to E-Roll, Hannah Brown, Moldbrain, and Suit Number 1. And a very special shout out goes to AR Animates for being the only one to support me on the Ralsei tier. And of course, we always have to give a huge shout out to Captain APAC, the only mad lad willing and able to support me on the Spampton tier. My deepest thanks go out to all of you for supporting me in this way, as it really does go a long way towards relieving my financial woes, which also helps me focus on making content for you all. And also, just to be clear, while I am extremely grateful for the donations of my larger contributors, I'm appreciative for every dollar that anyone sends my way. I know that plenty of you out there would happily throw money my way if you could afford it, and I just want you to know that just your viewership is more than enough support for me. Giving me money is just a very kind bonus. So, again, thank you all so much. And with that, it's time for me to sign out. Like if you enjoyed the video, comment if you've got something to say, subscribe if you want to see more, and as always, have a fantastic day.